Hello and welcome to today's very important topic, and that is inflammatory reaction sequence. Today we will be talking about the sequence of events that unfold when we have an inflammatory reaction. So we have about what I divided it into 8 steps, that these 8 steps through which inflammation or the inflammatory reaction will manifest. So before we go through the details of these steps of the inflammatory reaction sequence, let's just have a very brief, quick review of what led up to inflammation. So when we talk about the inflammatory reaction sequence, we have a foundation and a good understanding of what led to that inflammation, so everything can make sense. All right, so we talked about that a normal cell, the cell being the basic unit of health, the cell is the basic unit of disease, the cell is the basic unit of physiology, the cell is the basic unit of pathology, the cell is the basic unit of life. So that cell is, when the cell is normally functioning, when the cell is structurally and functionally, when the cell is structurally and functionally stable, that cell is a healthy cell, that cell is an active cell. That cell, that normal cell in the state of homeostasis, in the state of steady state, that cell will be subjected to continuous stressful stimuli, continuous noxious stimuli such as ultraviolet radiation, such as infections, bacterial infection, fungal infection, viral infection, parasitic infection, and so on and so forth, and trauma. That is also a form of stress. So now the cell is already equipped with built-in systems that counter the stressful stimuli and push it and cause it to subside. However, if the stressful stimuli, the intensity of that stimuli is very severe, if the duration of that stimuli is just so long, then the cell will be overwhelmed. Those built-in systems that keep the cell in homeostasis will now be overwhelmed due to the severity and duration of the stressful stimuli, being infection, as we said, ultraviolet radiation, trauma, for example. Then the cell will be injured. If the stressful stimuli keeps on propagating, then that cell will now undergo, it will become irreversibly injured. If the cell can overcome that stressful stimuli, it will become a reversible injury. The cell will go right back to a normal homeostatic cell. However, if the cell is damaged, then it will be irreversible injury. Irreversible injury, the cell now will undergo apoptosis and properly remove and get rid of itself. But if the damage is just so severe, the cell will now die, but not through apoptosis. It will die through necrosis, and necrosis leads to inflammation. So now we can talk about what inflammation is. It's very important to know all the sequence of events that lead to inflammation. And now we have arrived at inflammation, probably acute inflammation, which is the immediate step right after necrotic cell death. So we had a normal cell undergoing stress. Stress is so much, the cell is irreversibly injured, irreversibly damaged beyond salvage. Then the cell dies. We have cell death through necrosis, and after necrosis we have acute inflammation. The outcome of acute inflammation is either full resolution, the cell will go right back to a normal cell, homeostatic cell, or the second outcome could be healing by fibrosis or scarring, or the third outcome could be chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation, yes, it comes right after acute inflammation, but that does not mean chronic inflammation cannot arise de novo. It does not mean chronic inflammation cannot happen without prior acute inflammation. Yes, it can happen, but there's two possibilities. We can have chronic inflammation right after acute inflammation, or we can have a self-sufficient or a chronic inflammation that arises de novo. So now we have arrived at acute inflammation or inflammation, and let's now talk about all the steps that lead to all the steps that happen or take place in inflammation. Okay, what you need to know first of all is that there's a stimulus, and the stimulus could be the injurious stimulus, the stressful, noxious stimulus. Like I said, infection, ultraviolet radiation, or trauma. So when the cell is damaged by necrosis, the cell membrane is fragmented. You have the intercellular content falls right out into neighboring tissue. There are built-in white blood cells, immune defense cells that are resident, known as sentinel cells. These sentinel cells are mast cells, dendritic cells, and macrophages. So these macrophages, they have receptors. They have receptors that mechanically bind to bacteria, lipopolysaccharides, or maybe glycoproteins, or they have toll-like receptors, TLCs, toll-like receptors, and among other receptors that actually bind to fragments of necrotic debris or probably infectious agents. They bind them mechanically, leading to the stimulation of these resident cells, these sentinel cells, and cause them to secrete cytokines. These cytokines secreted by the sentinel cells, known as I said, mast cells, dendritic cells, and macrophages. You will be asked on the exam, what are the sentinel resident cells that are the first step in the inflammatory reaction, the cells that actually detect an immediate injury and then report it to the circulation. It's actually the sentinel cells, and they are mast cells, dendritic cells, and macrophages. So the third step is when mast cells, dendritic cells, macrophages, these sentinel cells secrete cytokines and mediators. These mediators go in the blood, and these mediators, these cytokines, they, like a magnet, cause the immune cells in the blood to start gravitating or to start to come towards the site at which these cytokines are being secreted by the sentinel cells, the macrophages and the mast cells and the dendritic cells. Nowhere else besides a site where there is an injury and sentinel cells are involved and secreting cytokines, these immune cells will only aggregate and gather at a site where cytokines are released, because cytokines are the ones who Cytokines are the chemical substances that absorb or attract these macrophages or these circulating white blood cells, such as leukocytes, known as the neutrophils, these leukocytes known as the neutrophils, and also monocytes. So I will show you in the diagram in a little bit, and then so now you will have a second round of white blood cells, a second round of immune cells known as monocytes and macrophages, and then we will have permeability of the blood vessels. We will have dilation of arterioles and then these white blood cells will start leaking through these permeability pores surrounding the site of the inflammation, and the leakage of those white blood cells among other proteins and cytokines and plasma, that causes swelling known as the edema. So that's why the site of inflammation is known to be swollen up. It's swelling because due to the permeability caused by the release of these cytokines. So cytokines interact with the endothelial cells in the blood vessels, causing them to retract and open side pores through which these monocytes, these immune blood cells, and the leukocytes such as neutrophils to leak out through the pores so they can go to the site of the inflammation and combat these infective cells and remove all the debris and properly get rid of it. And the next step after that is the actual either resolution, as we mentioned, resolution where the cells will go right back to normal cells, or there will be healing by fibrosis or scarring, or then we could progress to a more intense, more severe phase of inflammation, and that is chronic inflammation. So now let's go through the diagram step by step. So let's see what we have here. Let us see what we have here. Okay, the electricity power keeps on. I apologize. The electric power keeps on. Okay, welcome to my beautiful country. Sending you nice, warm regards from the all wonderful Sudan. And we are keeping the faith up that one day everything will be amazing and there will always be electricity and things will get better. Okay, electricity, where are you? Please come back soon. Okay, so meanwhile, electricity comes back. Just keep in mind that we just talked about how in inflammation we have a sequence of events that starts with an injurious, stressful stimulus damaging the cells in our tissues, in the particular tissue. The stimulus could be the stimulus could very well be trauma, could be infection, could very well be ultraviolet radiation, and the damage that is caused by the injurious stimuli could actually be detected mechanically by receptors on the surfaces of sentinel cells such as mast cells. Yes, electricity is back on. So let us now go through the details. I apologize. Let us now go through the details of what happens in the inflammatory reaction sequence. So the first step is we have a stimulus such as ultraviolet radiation. Could also be an infection damaging the you see these green cells damaging the cells in our body. And then that was the first step, number one. Step number two is recognition of the foreign invaders, these microbes, or detection of the debris of damaged cells by receptors on the surface of sentinel cells such as mast cells and dendritic cells. You see the dendritic cells are actually engulfing. You see the receptors actually detect the debris and detect the glycoproteins and the polysaccharides at the surface of invading agents. So we have the mast cells, dendritic cells, and macrophages. The third step is those mast cells, dendritic cells, and macrophages that are resident in the tissues. They are the front line, the first responders. They actually secrete mediators such as vasoactive amines and cytokines. These cytokines start to cause vasodilation, and the vasodilation increases the blood flow to the site of the inflammation from which cytokines are being released, and they also increase the vascular permeability. Those pores cause a retraction between the endothelial cells through which those cells will come out, and recruitment of leukocytes and white blood cells, that leukocytes such as neutrophils, and monocytes that will later on differentiate into macrophages. So now that leads to edema, because now from the blood we have substances leaking out to the site of inflammation. We have substances such as plasma, such as proteins, such as cytokines, such as water, such as protein-rich fluid known as the exudate. So we have a plasma exudate. If we take a sample from the edema, at the site of inflammation, and we examine it, we will see that it is protein rich. The edema of inflammation is protein rich. It's called an exudate. However, somebody who has an edema, but the analysis of that analysis of that edema shows a protein poor solution, that shows you it's not an exudate, it's a transudate. Transudate is a protein poor solution, while edema is a protein rich solution. Why is edema protein rich solution? The exudate is protein rich because it's full of cytokines. Cytokines are proteins, and there's also white blood cells. However, in transudate, there is protein poor solution because now the leakage is due to, for example, pulmonary edema or renal failure or congestive heart disease. And the congestive heart disease, due to the congestion of blood and the obstruction, the blood cannot flow into the heart. That causes the engorgement of blood vessels with blood that is waiting in line to go to the heart, but it cannot go due to the congestive heart failure. Now this blood will start leaking through the endothelial pores, and it will start to cause a swelling and edema. But when we look at the content of that edema, we will see it's a transudate. It does not have immune cells or cytokines because it is not caused by an inflammation. It is actually caused by congestive heart failure. So it's very important to know the difference between exudate, protein rich, associated with inflammation. That's why it has a lot of white blood cells and proteins, while transudate is protein poor, and this protein poor solution is due to congestive heart failure, for example. Then the next step after edema is as we said, there is the elimination of microbes and dead tissue by these neutrophils and the macrophages. So you have to understand that macrophages are not circulating in the blood as macrophages. They are circulating as monocytes, but once they leave the blood, they differentiate into macrophages. While the nuclear cells, such as these neutrophils, these leukocytes, are actually fully differentiated in the blood, and they exit the blood as neutrophils, and they participate in step number 6, and that is the elimination of microbes and dead tissue. After the elimination hopefully succeeds, what happens is macrophages would release cytokines and growth factors to fibroblast in the tissue, and that causes repair either by resolution or resolution is healing by first intention, primary union, or healing by second intention, and that is by fibrosis, scarring, and the last possible outcome of inflammation is actually chronic inflammation. Then we have repair. That's step number 8. So it's very important. So these extracellular matrix proteins and cells, they interact with the cytokines and growth factors released from macrophages that initiate the repair process. It's very important to know the steps. Again, you have a stimulus that negative is injurious stimulus, stressful stimuli that damages the tissues and the cells, and there are built-in resident sentinel cells such as mast cells, dendritic cells, and macrophages that detect these the debris of the necrotic debris of the injured cells, or they can actually detect the infective agents, and they can send mediators such as vasoactive amines and cytokines, prostaglandins, and so on into the blood, and that causes vasodilation to increase the blood supply to the site of injury or the site of inflammation, and that increases vascular permeability and retraction of endothelial cells to make openings and pores through which neutrophils would leak out to the site of inflammation, where they can combat stressful stimuli. And we have monocytes that fully differentiate into macrophages, and then there will be elimination of microbes and dead cells. And obviously we talked about how edema is it's an exudate edema associated with inflammation, but not transudate edema. Transudate edema is protein poor, associated with pathological conditions such as congestive heart failure, while exudative edema is associated with inflammation. And macrophages release growth factors and cytokines to fibroblasts in order to initiate repair. Hopefully a full resolution takes place, or healing by scarring, or last but not least, we can have if things go awry or the damage is just too severe, then the tissue will now move on to a stage of chronic inflammation. Okay, I just want to leave you with a bunch of brief reminders, and that is, the brief reminders are, when we have inflammation, we have 5 cardinal signs of inflammation. They are, in Latin, rubor, and that is redness; calor, and that is heat; and dolor, and that is pain. And then we have tumor, and that is swelling. And then we have functiolasa, and that is loss of function. And that should make sense because we have swelling due to the edema, we have heat due to the rush of blood to the site of inflammation due to the dilation of blood vessels initiated by the cytokines released by these sentinel cells such as macrophages. And we have swelling due to the edema. We have pain due to release of prostaglandins that irritate the nerve endings in the tissues, so that's why there's pain. And there's also swelling and redness due to the blood rushing, carrying all these white blood cells to the site of inflammation in order to defend the body against these intruding or these invaders. And what I want to leave you with is that you have to understand that there's 2 different kinds of edema. There's an exudative edema, and that is associated with inflammation because it's an edema that is full of cytokines and full of immune cells that are rushing to the site of inflammation and leaking through these endothelial retraction and pores. And also, in congestive heart failure, you have a transudate, that is protein poor edema. So I hope that makes sense. I hope I did not leave anything out. So this is the inflammatory reaction sequence. When it comes to pharmacology, we take drugs, anti-inflammatory reactions that target the cytokines, cytokines such as interleukins and chemokines and so on. So these monocytes and these leukocytes gravitate towards the site of the cytokines due to the release of chemokines and leukotrienes and interleukins and other cytokines that cause these immune cells to gravitate towards the site of injury in order to initiate the inflammation. So inflammation paves the way for healing, but it first has to take place in order to remove all these dangerous invaders. I hope this was a very good step into understanding or having a good understanding of the events that take place in the inflammatory reaction. If you have questions, post them down there. And thank you very much, and I'll see you in our next lesson.